Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all so much for joining us today to talk about entitlements and specifically parking reductions in the mountain region. My name is Mallory Baker. I know some of you. I'm a consultant at Walker in our Denver office, and I also lead our entitlements practice out of the Denver office and throughout the mountain region. Before I joined Walker, I actually worked at a firm that did staff augmentation and development in small communities throughout the Mountain West, and I got to learn a lot about how staff operate and what they care about when it comes to entitlements requests such as these. So I'm really excited to bring that knowledge to Walker and talk a little bit about that today with you all. So in terms of what we're going over today, we'll talk a little bit about what a parking reduction is, very simple. Then we'll get into different types of reductions that we typically see and request on behalf of our clients. A little bit about what makes a successful reduction request. And then finally, we'll talk through a couple examples, and then we'll of course open it up to questions and discussion following the presentation. So first, really basic, what is a parking reduction? Quite simply, a parking reduction is an official allowance on behalf of the municipality in which you're developing to build fewer parking spaces than set forth in the municipal regulations, generally in the municipal zoning code. There are many reasons why you might request a parking reduction, and we'll talk a little bit about those reasons later on in the presentation. But what we found is so frequently regulations take a really long time to follow what we're seeing in the market. While developers care greatly about how their parking and transportation assets function, and those are really essential components of any development project, very frequently the bloated off-street parking requirements that municipalities set forth in their codes just don't match what is needed on the ground for any given development. So we've really seen an uptick in requests for parking reductions in recent years, and so that's why we wanted to talk a little bit about them today. When to apply for a parking reduction, generally they're officially applied for during the site development plan process. And granted upon SDP approval. So generally before you apply for a building permit, you would receive in your zoning permit allowance to build fewer parking spaces than set forth in the municipal code. But we really advocate for an earlier approach. It's never too early once you start thinking about a development to start thinking about your parking and transportation asset planning. And really in terms of communication with the municipality on that planning, you really want to start that conversation earlier in the concept plan meeting, or maybe even earlier when you're just starting to talk to the municipality about the possibility of this development, to bring that up and sort of take a temperature gauge on how that would be received by the community, whether there are any voices surrounding parking or transportation challenges that you should be aware of as you start this process. So again, we really emphasize the earlier the better when it comes to applying for parking reductions. So why apply? We've already touched upon some of these issues, but really you want to apply for a parking reduction because you're adjusting for market realities that aren't reflected in the regulations. Of course, in pretty much all cases, regulations lag significantly behind market fluctuations and trends. So as an example, Uber and Lyft has really permeated our city and suburban markets for almost a decade at this point, but regulations are in no way reflective of that reality. And in fact, even public transit investments and increases in convenience and headways are not reflected in the regulatory requirements set forth in the zoning code. So applying for a parking reduction really allows you in many cases to adjust for what's actually happening on the ground in a way that's just not reflected in the regulations and probably won't be for quite a while. Secondly, a really, probably the most common reason, for good reason, to apply for a parking reduction is to save space and money. Obviously parking is really, really expensive to build, and it's by no means a cash cow. It's taking up valuable space in your development program, and it's not really generating the lease rates or the annual revenue that you need to make your project work. Depending on where you're building, parking is always expensive, but especially in our mountain communities, parking can cost up to $35,000, even $40,000 a space, and that's just the pure construction costs. That doesn't even account for land acquisition costs, site preparation costs, and the like. Additionally, you're giving up valuable space when you're building parking assets. One way to avoid that is to go subgrade, but of course that adds significant costs, and then you're dealing with water table issues and the like. So you might want to save space so you can dedicate that space to really the highest and best use for your specific site. And finally, a more ideological reason, and typically one that sort of like overarches all of these reduction requests, is that you really want to create a parking plan that reflects your broader project vision and goals. So you might have, a vision for your project that includes a lot of arrivals from multimodal transportation, public transit, non-single occupancy vehicle uses, especially if you're creating a mixed use project that includes a lot of, walkable elements and the like. You might not want to include a ton of parking that would encourage single occupancy vehicle arrivals. In addition, so frequently you can often create a parking plan that actually reflects the broader goals and vision of the municipality in which you're developing. So often we see municipal comprehensive plans that are really progressive in terms of their transportation goals, vehicle miles traveled goals, reduction in single occupancy vehicle usage, but simultaneously their off-street parking requirements and the regulations that govern development in that community are just not reflective of that message. So in this way, you can actually assist the municipality in its broader effort to bolster its multimodal transportation assets. So now we'll get in a little bit to different types of reductions that you can request. The first kind is static reductions, and these are really prescribed reductions that are administratively granted. So generally they're related to amenities or community assets deemed desirable by the municipality, and that varies from municipality to municipality, and we'll talk a little bit more about what those look like. But those can be use-based, like affordable housing, or those can be amenity or asset-based, like car share, bike share, and the like. So these are prescribed requirements that are adopted through ordinance in the zoning code, where if you provide X, you get Y number of spaces off, or X percentage of spaces off your requirement. So some typical types of static reductions that we see in municipal environments, and these vary again from municipality to municipality dependent on what amenities and assets they have deemed desirable. Things like car share, which we see in the Denver zoning code, for example, and in a lot of other municipalities. Things like bike share. Sometimes if you build structured parking, you can get a reduction. Of course, then you have to pay for structured parking. So that's, an issue in and of itself. Sometimes motorcycle or scooter parking provision. Other frequent ones are, if you're doing affordable housing or assisted living facilities, those types of uses can also result in a prescribed static reduction from off-street parking requirements. We see these all the time as ways to just kind of make up for a couple spaces that are missing in the program, but a lot of our clients have trouble really wrapping their heads around what these static reductions are committing them to. In terms of pros, they're administratively granted, meaning that they're granted by staff. So you don't have to go to a board of adjustment, a town board, a city council, or have a political process to get these reductions. Again, they're non-political. They've already been adopted through ordinance by city council, town board, whatever the decision maker is for their code. And finally, there are known quantities. So you know precisely how many spaces you're getting shaved off, and you can reflect that in your development budget. Now, there are also major negatives to these static reductions. First, there's little to no correlation with actual parking demand in most of these cases. So if you are providing car share, if you are providing bike share, if you are providing motorcycle or scooter parking, those are great amenities, but they're not necessarily resulting in a corresponding reduction in parking demand. So you could still have spillover challenges or other operational challenges on your site if you choose to build fewer parking spaces as a result of these amenities. Secondly, they can take up program space that you need. So rather than building parking spaces, you're going to put in car share spaces. Well, generally those take up about the same amount of space. So if you're trying to save, spatial programming, then you really need to think about which of these static reductions is appropriate and will work in your case. Thirdly, there are monitored contracts involved in many of these amenities. So with car share, for example, it's really hard right now to actually get any car share company to agree to do a car share in the city of Denver. And so that will be a challenge if you choose to use that as a reduction and then you can't get a car share company to sign on to a contract. Also, it involves the city in ways that we don't really like or advocate for. So the city requires that you submit your contract to the city for its review, and you have to meet certain stipulations and requirements on behalf of the city, which you may not want to agree to. And especially if you're going to sell your development rather than self-operate, that can add an additional challenge because these are, of course, required to continue largely in perpetuity in order to make sure that you continue to fulfill your zoning permit requirements. And finally, these reductions are small. They typically only result in a couple space reduction. So in order to get a substantial reduction, you would have to have, let's say, like 50 bike shares, which would really be practically infeasible. So we'll talk a little bit about fluid reductions. And these are really reductions that are unique to your specific project and its particular factors, and are actually in alignment with the market demand that we would expect for your project. And while some municipalities do allow these types of reductions to be administratively granted, especially if you're only requesting a reduction under a certain percentage of the overall requirement, they typically do require the approval of a higher decision-making body. And that could be, the Board of Adjustment, the City Council, the Town Board. And also a key factor here is that means that you are subject to a public hearing. So those meetings are all public, and therefore they have to be publicly noticed. And then you're adding the additional complexity of bringing your case in the court of public opinion. So typical factors when it comes to these fluid reductions, when we develop justifications for large-scale parking reductions of this type, we are looking at alternative use-based parking ratios based on industry standards rather than the municipality-specific requirements. We are looking at shared parking, so especially with mixed-use projects, complementary parking demand uses within that site. We're looking at driving ratios, meaning the percentage of single occupancy vehicles that we're expecting to arrive at the site compared to uses of other types of transportation modes. We're looking at captive ratios, so sort of the interplay among different uses on the site. And finally, we're looking at active transportation demand and parking management on behalf of the owner and operator of the development. Are you doing parking cash outs? Are you providing employees with eco passes, those sorts of things can impact the projected parking demand for the site. So again, this type of reduction, of course, also has pros and cons. A key pro is that, again, this is really aligned with market demand. So instead of the reduction and the actual parking plan for the project being disparate and separate, it's really one plan. So we would project your appropriate demand based on market trends and our understanding of the market, and that would be the appropriate reduction to request. These are typically substantial and impactful reductions, so they really give you a big bang for your buck. They also can represent your project goals and values. So here you can actually incorporate, your plan for multimodal access to the site into how you're requesting your parking reduction in the entitlements process. And finally, as we discussed earlier, you can also help municipalities achieve their broader transportation and mobility goals through this parking reduction request. Again, there are also negatives with these types of reductions. They really require a lot of substantial documentation and justification around why you're asking for the reduction, and a real quantitative analysis surrounding the reduction that you're requesting. They're political in nature very frequently. So if a higher decision-making body is involved that includes elected or appointed officials, again, that involves a public hearing process. Those folks who are on those boards and committees can be political in nature. They can bring up anecdotal evidence or other things that you need to be aware of and ready for. And finally, they're not as guaranteed as static reductions. So it's harder to plan for an assumed reduction earlier in the process. So we get this question at Walker quite a bit. What if you just want to build less parking than you need? That's a reasonable approach, and we would understand that approach. However, we really want to emphasize that you should proceed with caution here. We really do not advocate approaching a municipality for a significant parking reduction that is not reflective of actual quantitative demand that you're projecting for your site. There are ways that you can avoid building a lot of parking that you don't need or don't want to build on your site without, academic and quantitative justification related to the market demand. Some measures that we would recommend include possibly looking at an off-site agreement to accommodate your parking demand and parking needs rather than building on-site. Technology solutions, so looking at maybe hydraulic lifts or other systems to increase the ability of the space that you have to meet your parking demand needs. Management and operational solutions, so some of that is the transportation demand management efforts that we talked about, and also just operations and management within the garage to make sure that the space is being used effectively and efficiently. Again, that's really only applicable if you are holding on to your development and not selling it. So really only if you are the owner and operator for a long period of time. Functional design, so also looking at the parking assets that you have and making sure that they're they're designed efficiently and effectively, and you are using that space in the best way possible. But again, really proceed with caution here. You can create some significant backlash from the municipality in which you're building if you build less than you need and then you have spillover or challenges with neighbors or other things that we've seen occur when developers choose to go this route. So what helps us be successful in these requests? Really, it's three components in my mind, regulatory knowledge, political knowledge, and finally, effective communication. So regulatory knowledge is really a deep understanding of the applicable code and reference materials, and also how staff interprets that code. That's also very important. code is obviously written down and published, but there are different reviewers in different municipalities that might take certain leeways or might interpret certain sections differently. So if you're used to working with one reviewer for a project, and suddenly he is retired and then another reviewer comes in, you should really start your relationship build and understand how they're interpreting that code. I had this exact situation happen in the city of Denver. We had a longtime reviewer that actually allowed administrative approvals of parking reductions through shared parking studies. And then after he retired, the department no longer allowed that to occur. So it was a big shift in how the city of Denver started to allow for large-scale parking reductions. Also know which parties are involved and which parties can ultimately approve your reduction that you're requesting. Is it administrative? Is it staff? Is it the director? Is it the Board of Adjustment? Is it City Council, et cetera? And then you can start to factor that understanding into your project schedule and your costs for the project, especially once you already formally submitted an SDP and you're paying the costs associated with that to your team. That's especially important. Secondly, understanding the political climate. This picture on the slide is really terrifying. I hope none of us are ever in a meeting that looks like this, but you really should understand the public sentiment and also engage with it. So understand, from staff, and really lean on staff to get an understanding of how are people feeling about parking in this community. If we're going to public hearing, what do we think are going to be the hot button issues? And really prepare for that in your materials and your quantitative justification and in your messaging. And also just be empathetic and sympathetic. Maybe hold a couple of your own neighborhood meetings if you're planning to go to the public hearing process, to kind of start to get to know the community and start to build champions on your side, especially if you're working on a high profile project in a city neighborhood. Finally, communication is so important, and we really encourage you to get your consultants involved directly with the municipality and the ownership if you're an architect as soon as possible. Your consultants can really help you understand what you're responsible for submitting to the municipality, what those submittal documents will actually do for you. I've seen a lot of clients come to us and ask us for shared parking studies, and then just submit them to the municipality without talking to us first or having us involved. And that can be really dangerous because the municipality maybe doesn't accept shared parking studies, or there's a city council process, or that's just not their process at all. And if we don't know that that entitlement is what you're going for, we can't help you in the way that is effective. So that is why it is so important to get us involved early if you're working with us or any consultant that you're working with for a parking reduction or a transportation related entitlement issue. So we'll walk through a couple examples, one in the city and one in a suburban environment. So this was in the city of Denver in the LoDo neighborhood. This is a hotel project. So this is a great example of market realities really not being reflected in the regulation. So LoDo has actually, compared to other dense downtown environments, a pretty high standard parking requirement in the Denver zoning code. And what was happening was, these regulations hadn't been changed for quite a long time. And on the ground, especially for hotels, parking demand was being significantly impacted by the public investment in the A line, so that connection from the airport to Union Station, and also the permeation of Uber and Lyft in the market. So a huge decrease in rental car usage, especially among business guests in downtown hotels. So we had a huge amount of data and quantitative justification to help us create the submittal materials for this parking reduction. It was a Board of Adjustment process, meaning we submitted as part of the SDP process, got staff buy-in, and then had to go to the Board of Adjustment for final approval. Another complication here was that the developer had decided that because of the size of the site, they didn't want to build parking on the site. They just didn't have the space to do it at the ground level or above, and they had water table issues and also the expense of going subgrade. So they decided to do a 100% offsite accommodation of parking demand using an offsite lease within 1,000 feet an ADA compliant walking distance of their site, and we helped them with that agreement as well. Walker was really involved early and also often. We were really seen as part of the overall team for the SDP submittal, and even beforehand helped with some of the concepts. And what that did for the team is, it not only kept us abreast of any programming changes or the like that would impact our work, but it also made sure that they could ask us sort of ad hoc questions about, if we change the building frontage, how will that impact our valet plan or the location of our porte-cochere, pickup and drop off needs, and that kind of thing. So it was really helpful that we were seen as part of the team, and we were also involved in every conversation with the city that had to do with parking and transportation or right-of-way usage. So ultimately, we went to the Board of Adjustment, presented our case, and were approved with an 88 space or 45% reduction from the off-street parking requirement, which is a huge win in this case. Ultimately, a $2.2 million cost savings on those spaces alone for that requirement because of that approval. So the client was excited about that, and also we were able to get the offsite agreement approved so that no on-site parking had to be built. So another example in a suburban environment, ultimately this project did not move forward, not because of parking, but because of a city land deal with the developer. But this was I wanted to bring up this process because it was really interesting. So this was the first official reduction request that Greenwood Village, parking reduction request, that Greenwood Village had ever gotten. So staff was really involved in messaging. Simultaneously, there was this strange sort of combative relationship between the city staff and city council. So we had to be aware of that and almost be champions for staff to help them understand and be champions for our process and our project so that they could go to city council and we could really act as a coordinated team. And that's the other thing I see so frequently is developers and architects and a lot of people that we work with really get excited about advocating for the parking reduction to city council or whoever the ultimate decision maker is, but they don't do the work with staff. And if staff doesn't like what you're doing, then chances are the decision makers aren't going to like it either. So really creating champions along that process. We also did like a little work session with their city council before we were even talking about the reduction, the specific reduction for this project, to really teach them about shared parking and changes in market realities that would impact parking demand. We also assisted with a couple separate neighborhood and community meetings around this project and about parking to kind of gauge temperature with the community, express our empathy around what they were experiencing, get a sense of what changes we could make to our program and planning to include some of their feedback. We were asking for 150 space or 32% reduction, so pretty substantial for this mixed use project. Again, ultimately the project didn't move forward, but I was really proud of the work that our team did to kind of prime the city council and staff for reduction requests in the future so that they were they're kind of ready to go for the next process, whoever brings it forward. So again, we're almost wrapped up here and then we'll open it up to questions, but we're really here to help you. A little bit about Walker, we really have been in this niche industry of parking and mobility for the last 55, almost 56 years. We've spent 40 years in Colorado. We actually just celebrated our anniversary. We're celebrating it this week. We do a lot of R&D on the impact of Uber and autonomous vehicles, curb management, a whole host of things on parking demand. And again, we work directly with municipalities and public agencies and actually help them, write their off-street parking requirements in a lot of cases. So we're really knowledgeable about what they want and how we can connect what they want with what you want. Contact information for me, a lot of you already know me, but I'm here if you need help or if you have questions that we can't fit into this call today, but I hope to hear from you guys. And with that, I'll open it up to questions and comments. Any other topics that you want to cover more in depth, we're here. Thank you guys.